Driving school teachers. What are the most outrageous things student drivers have done while with you? I used to work as a receptionist at a driving school and got to see the before and after for students and their parents. So many stories, but the two that come to mind that always flabbergasted me were 1. A mom telling her daughter to always go 10 miles under the speed limit no matter what right before her driving test. So if the speed limit is 25, she should go 15 and so on. I had to explain that unless conditions required her to go slower than speed limit, weather, traffic, etc., she becomes more of a hazard if she is going under speed limit all the time. I'm all for driving safe, but there are better ways to go about it. 2. The girl who got in an accident on her driving test that she caused. I believe she ran a red that had been red for a while and hit a car that had right of way in front of a cop. She didn't understand why she failed and tried to argue about it and schedule an appointment for the same day to retake. I know a guy who used to give the final exams for people contesting suspensions of their driver's license with the DMV. He had horror stories to tell me about how bad drivers were. He had multiple stories about students not even making it out of the parking lot before failing and losing their licenses permanently. But the best was when a woman was backing out of the parking space too quickly and hit a car behind her. He turns to the driver and tells her to park back in the space. She guns it and hits the DMV building itself. She then turns to him and asks, "Did I pass?" He said it was the shortest test of his career. I had an instructor who was famous for never using his teacher's brake, even when he should. I was riding in the backseat when another student was merging onto the freeway for the first time. The kid is looking over his shoulder and concentrating. He's determined to make the merge and never looked forward as he accelerated down the ramp. We drifted off the side and hit the snowbank at 50 miles per hour. Snow was roaring over the hood, and we ground to a stop buried to the top of the windshield, with an orange student driver sign sticking out the top. The kid was shaking and gripping the wheel with white knuckles when the teacher says, as calmly as can be, "You ought to look forward once in a while when you go down the ramp." Dang. That instructor was committed to proving his point. I'm not an instructor, but occasionally babysit new drivers, trucks and buses. In the UK, part of the larger vehicle tests are conducted in a yard before leaving to do the on-road part of the examination. These parts are observed by the examiner from outside the vehicle, and include a reversing exercise and an emergency stop. In short, bus test candidate knocked over the examiner during the emergency stop, sending him and his clipboard flying a few meters onto tarmac. Luckily he was not seriously hurt, but everybody from then on used to make an exaggerated stand the heck back motion whenever this part of the test happened. Nearly had my left foot peg taken off by a red Porsche 911, which was weaving through traffic at high speed on the highway during my final motorcycle license exam. I figured I insta-failed because I was changing lanes into him, and an unsafe lane change is grounds for failure. I did shoulder check before changing lanes, but the dude was going so fast he wasn't in my line of sight yet. I passed. When I took my driving test, about 50 years ago, we had to parallel park. It was the last part of the test. The testing station was in a strip mall that had some cars parked parallel along the edges. The tester told me go ahead and do the parallel parking portion. I did it between two of the cars parked along the edges. Only after I successfully parked did the instructor say, "You were supposed to do it between the orange cones over there, but you were doing so well I thought I'd just let it go." Well, if it works, it works. I used to live in Paris as a teenager. People there drive wildly. I was taking the final exam. I was super focused on not making mistakes when some crazy driver just purposely missed a stop sign and rushed in front of me. The examiner had to do an emergency brake, which usually is a major mistake. I thought that's it, I'm fricked, and then he opened the window, flipped at the other car while yelling some rich words at him, then calmly told me Parisian are buttholes. Continue please, and I passed. Student ran over a grey squirrel, stopped the car, got out and got it, brought it back to the car and asked if she could bring it to a veterinary's office. My first behind the wheel, my instructor tried to tell me that if I were faced with a squirrel in the road and in a lot of traffic, I should run over the squirrel to avoid an accident. I told him that I hated that idea, So he told me I could instead keep good distance from the cars behind me to try to give myself time to brake for squirrels. My instructor told us of a girl who drove into a mural, a La Willy Coyote, because one of her eyes was legally blind and she thought it was the road. Turns out depth perception is important after all. Not a teacher, but one time in a driver's ed class this girl was driving and ran over a loud, clunky manhole cover that thumped. She was always nervous when it was her turn to drive. I guess she didn't see it coming because she screamed and goes, "What was that?" The teacher looks back and goes, "Oh god, it's a dog. Oh god, he's flopping. We gotta go back and finish him off." Stuff like that while the girl descends into a kind of jittery sobbing. Anyways, she threw up in our school driver's ed car and we had to keep using it anyways. A whole spring semester of puke smell in 5th period. I couldn't help but laugh at that. We gotta go back and finish him off LMAO. I had a student so excited to drive that when he opened the door to get in he hit himself in the forehead with the door and cut himself so bad I had to drive him to the hospital to get stitches. Same thing happened to me once going into a library. I taught mostly foreign students studying in the US. I have lots of stories. The first is about a mid-30s woman from Bangladesh. We are driving around a suburban neighborhood getting acclimated to making 90-degree turns. Pretty low-key, not scary stuff. Her phone rings, so she stops in the middle of the road to reach her purse in the backseat to answer her call. I informed her she must first pull to the side of the road as you cannot just stop in the middle of the street. She told me I could not tell her what to do. The second one was a woman in her late 20s from Saudi Arabia. She was graduating college in 3 weeks and wanted to go home with a DL as women could not drive in her country. I go to pick her up and I ask the standard, "Have you ever driven before?" She replied she knew what she was doing. 3 minutes in I ask her again because she was performing like this was her first time behind the wheel. She then stated that she had watched her family drive many times from her vantage point in the back seat. I made her pull over and I drove her to an empty parking lot. She was just not getting it after about 4 actual hours in the car with me on multiple days, but she insisted I take her to the licensing bureau for her driving test. I had no choice but to take her even though I knew she would fail. They call her name and off she goes with the testing person. 7 minutes later the tester walks through the door and straight up to me. She said the woman had about taken out a school bus and that she, the tester, had to grab the wheel to keep them out of the ditch. I was asked for advance warning if I ever returned with such a bad driver. Now I'm curious what the fatality rate is for driving instructors and exam proctors. My driver instructor once, clearly hungover, but on a Pink Floyd CD and had me drive around country roads for 50 minutes while he had a nap. I've got a similar sorta one, but on my actual test, she entered the car completely stinking of weed and I swear she wasn't even paying attention to my driving. Every time I looked over she was fricking about with her pen or the air conditioning. She still failed me, LOL. I was the student during one of my 3-hour lessons, where we usually would take the highways out to the city. The instructor told me to pull into a bank parking lot. He goes inside and leaves me there for 45-50 minutes. He finally comes back and says, "Sorry, I lost my debit card last week and needed a new one." Then tells me that we'll have to extend my lesson by an hour to make up for it. I told him that wouldn't work as I had a shift at work and extending the lesson would make me late. I get that banks have horribly short hours, but that doesn't mean you screw over the 16-year-old who spent 5 months saving for your dang driving school to get there while they're open. That hour I lost never did get made up on another day. Also, the dude had no clue how to teach parallel parking and I almost failed that portion of my driving test following the way he showed me. My brother. Good lord, my little brother. He has always been just a touch slower when learning the important motor stuff. He didn't learn to ride his bike until he was in high school and he took 3 or 4 tries to get his license. One scenario that best comes to mind is when he wanted to go get Dairy Queen. He offered to pay if I just sat in the car so he could practice driving. Now it's important to note I was already a little strung up because I had just been a passenger in a car accident shortly before and was dealing with the aftermath of it emotionally. But it was free Dairy Queen so I agreed to go. My god. My life flashed before my eyes. He drove way too fast everywhere. We live in the suburbs with kids running around, and stopped just a hair short of rear-ending every single car in front of him at red lights. And then, Fed decides to just casually take a right on a left light. We're in America. We do a lot of weird crap, but that's not one of them. When I asked him why, he said he forgot he couldn't do it. I demanded he stop the car and let me drive. We did not get ice cream and I was banned from driving with him ever again. So I won one. It's right on red, always right. When I was taking the test for my license, the teacher was a good high school friend of my dad's. Him and I were talking about all the fun memories they had and how my dad was a trucker, so he taught me a lot about driving and specifically trailers. We both were so focused on the conversation we didn't realize we had gone 25-30 minutes down the road and still had to go back. We laughed and I apologized to my grandma about taking so long. I passed my driver's license in Inglewood, CA. I was not very familiar with the neighborhood. They just happened to have a space for exam appointment. I pull up to an intersection, and then a random car starts to do donuts in the middle of the intersection for a couple of minutes. The instructor was unimpressed. She just told me to wait and to go once they were done. Inglewood, CA. Then a random car starts to do donuts in the middle of the intersection. That checks out. The most terrifying one I've heard of was from a colleague. Like me, he takes drivers out to familiarize them with new routes, procedures, etc. In this instance, the vehicle was a 38-ton wagon. About halfway through the training trip, the guy just freezes solid, literally mid-sentence. Truck is going around a curve, and they end up on the opposite side of the carriageway, getting dodged by oncoming traffic. By a miracle, nothing gets hit, and a few seconds later he snaps back awake and veers back over to the correct side of the road. Needless to say, they stop, clean out their underwear, and my buddy takes over. Turns out he'd had a seizure, and once diagnosed had his truck license revoked. Had no medical history of anything prior to this happening. I'm not a teacher, but I remember once in driving class a classmate of mine accidentally drove and flew through a fence straight onto the open road. Thankfully there was no one there at the moment, or that could have been catastrophic. Not a driving teacher, but the lady who taught me 30 years ago was telling me that when she was taking one of her students on an on-ramp for I-95, the kid didn't actually turn to keep up with the ramp and just general lead them off the on-ramp. I was the student. At 16, I had a very bad undiagnosed and untreated anxiety disorder. I was absolutely terrified to get behind the wheel with the thought of being the one responsible for operating a 2-ton killing machine. I let the instructor know this, and thought maybe we'd ease into it with empty parking lots and back roads. No, that wasn't the case. Daryl decided it would be best to take me right into rush hour traffic on the highway through town. At one point, I turned right too early and panic took hold. I floored it and Daryl had to hit the brakes before we went through a fence. I left some pretty impressive scorch marks on the road. The next 20 minutes consisted of me hyperventilating and crying while he vainly tried to comfort me. He ended up driving me home. Our next lesson started in the empty parking lot of an ice arena where I worked on making turns. As someone has pointed out in a past thread, immersion therapy only works if the patient is wholly comfortable and in control of the situation. Simply throwing them into the situation they fear most is only going to make their anxiety worse. I'm a police driving instructor, so I teach new recruits emergency operations of police cars. I don't have any great stories personally. However, when I was at the academy as a guest instructor once, I witnessed something pretty crazy. It was the first day that the recruits were going to run at high speeds with lights and sirens. The way that it works is that an instructor is always in the car with the recruits. I watched as a car driven by a recruit made the turn onto the beginning of the course. The lights and siren came on and the car accelerated down the road. At the end of this road there is a stop sign at a T intersection, and on the other side of the intersection is some grass and then the forest. You're supposed to stop, clear the intersection, and turn right. The car kept accelerating toward the intersection longer than what we were used to seeing, but I thought maybe this was just a particularly aggressive recruit. Most of them are more timid on the first few runs. However, the car was way past where they normally start slowing down, and looked like it was going to blow through the intersection. when suddenly we see the car veer to the right and spin out into the grass. We then see the instructor and the recruit get out of the car and the instructor is yelling and cussing at the recruit. They switch seats and come driving back to the staging area. The instructor gets out and meets with the head instructor. He explains that as they approached the intersection and he began to realize that the recruit was not stopping, he looked over and saw that the recruit had a glazed over look on his face, kind of like a 1,000-yard stare. He started yelling at the recruit to stop, but the recruit was not reacting at all. Realizing they were about to run through the intersection and go into the woods, he grabbed the wheel from the recruit and put them into a spin. When he asked the recruit what the heck happened, the recruit said, "Sometimes, when I get stressed, I kind of halfway black out." That was the end of the recruit's law enforcement journey, as that trait is not very compatible with the career. I had a co-worker driving instructor in South Australia who had trained drivers for 30 years longer than me, and I asked him, "What is the worst driver you have ever had, Paul?" Right away he told me, but I forget her name. She was a little Asian woman who was very nice but would get transfixed behind the wheel. She never spoke, just nodded and never seemed to take anything in or change her bad habits. She had over 50 driving lessons before Paul gave up on her. He said one time she ran someone over. I asked what happened and he said we were approaching a roadworks where the guy was standing with a stop sign and cones, and she pulled up and was first in line. She went too close to the guy with the sign and he seemed a little uncomfortable. The car has signs, she is learning. So he gave me the thumbs up with a concerned face like, "Is it alright?" I gave him the thumbs up and confident nod, "Yes, it's fine. Don't worry." I explained to her she must pull over slowly to the other side of the road and turn away from the guy and cones. I kept asking her if she understood and she would nod. Eventually the man turned his sign around and she floored it straight at him. He fell on the hood and grabbed the windscreen wipers. He was screaming and I was screaming at her while applying the passenger brake. At this point she was staring blankly ahead as if she wasn't there and yet accelerating the car as much as she could. Foot to the floor, transfixed. This is a true story. Thankfully I never had someone as bad as that. I certainly have had my experiences with mental illness before, but frankly that sounds like somebody looking at the world trough a tiny pin. My driving instructor actually was outrageous. It was my first driving lesson with an instructor and it was going fine. Besides the instructor not saying a word, I was stopped at a stop sign and someone hit us from behind. She starts screaming, "God freaking damn it," and gets out of the car to check the damage. It turns out that she actually was the driving instructor for the person that hit us. After she did whatever with the person that hit us, she throws open the driver door and says, "Just get out. I'm going to drive now." She then sped back to my house and said we were done for the day. This being my first time driving with an instructor, I had to wonder what it was that I did wrong. She passed me off to a different instructor. On the sheet that he was reading, I saw that it said, "He is a really bad driver. Be careful," in huge red letters. But I had no problem with the new instructor and didn't make a single mistake. He said that he had no idea what she meant by me being a bad driver. A couple years later, the instructor was in the news for being arrested for a DUI. Everything made sense then. Not the instructor, but the student. I took my driver's ed course, rode with the instructor. Everything went well. Then as I'm driving back to my house, he starts asking me questions about being saved by Jesus. Turns out, he was a born-again Christian and would use his position to try and speak with kids and their parents about converting to Christianity. Well, joke's on you. I grew up Presbyterian, which as far as I've figured out, means that if you've got to mow the lawn on a Sunday morning, you skip church. My parents were not amused when we got back to the house. Couple years later, he got arrested for child molestation. So that's that. Well, that jumped from 0 to 100. I'm not going to lie, I scrolled these answers looking for a story about myself, haha. When I was 15 I couldn't parallel park to save my life in the parking lot with the cones. After a few practices I'd yet to get it, even once. I just started screaming and floored it. I ran all the cones over just screaming at the top of my lungs. The instructor made me get out of the car, right the cones. I was dragging one under the car, and have a smoke or something. I won't tell you, mom. Haha. I did just that and we resumed driving after I promised to never do that again. Fun fact, half my life later I'm the designated parallel parker of my friend's family. I absolutely can get that large vehicle into that little space. I'm sure I scared the pee out of that man that day though. Teenagers are wild. I was no exception. I ran over the instructor's foot while parallel parking. No idea why he didn't move. I was going super slow. Not a teacher, but years ago when I was taking my driving test it was snowing, so I was wearing really big boots I was not familiar with. My foot got stuck between something and the gas pedal. Instructor had to slam on the brakes while I was holding it at wide open throttle. Did an amazing first burnout. Now I drag race. Fecking ripper. This is the opposite of what you asked but kind of related. I tried to turn left on a red and my instructor yelled at me and slammed on the brake. Here's the story. My driver's ed instructor was notoriously awful. She used to smoke in the car. She didn't explain anything. She barely taught anything. She, on more than one occasion, fell asleep in the car while on test drive with students. So, little 15-year-old dumb butt me driving along doing fine. Stopped at a red. It had an advanced phase where cars were going through on a red and arrow, I think. So I ask my teacher if I can go on a red, no arrow anymore. And she sort of mumbles. What I thought was yes. So I start to go and I'm like half in the intersections before she comes back to life and screams, "What are you doing?" and slams on the brakes. I tried to explain that I'd asked and she just yelled at me and told me to finish the drive back to school. Freaking hated the way she taught. During my driving test for my license the first time I went to make a left after a stop sign and the instructor pulled the e-brake because there was a car about a quarter of a mile down the road coming towards me and then he failed me. I was so pee off. This car literally would have taken 20 seconds to reach the intersection I was turning from. Driving school student. My teacher used to comment on every single attractive female he saw walking down the street, including teenagers. Then he'd get mad at me for not joining and feeling uncomfortable with it. Bruh, you're like 40 talking about my classmate's tight butt. Not a teacher, but I was a terrible student. I came to the US for school when I was 20. You can have someone to teach you at that age instead of getting into driving school. My boyfriend at that time was teaching me. We went on a straight road once and I did pretty good. So he assumed I had learned the basic back in my hometown. No, he was so wrong. The next lesson was on a busy road with traffic, and I was told to take a left turn. I was also being stupid trying to impress him, so I didn't tell him I actually had no idea how to turn at all. When car kept coming, he grabbed my wheels and I panicked. We ended up drove straight into someone's truck and I destroyed his new Jeep. Yep, lesson learned. Don't overestimate yourself and get a professional to teach you. This wasn't too bad, but I was a very nervous driver, still am, in part because I was involved in a wreck about a year before learning to drive. Day of my test is like the hottest day of summer. The state instructor gets in the car and tells me to head out, and it's lunchtime, so it's a rush of everyone trying to get to the fast food places on their short 1-hour breaks. I had been waiting to take my test for a good hour or so my car is hot as heck. And I'm not too nervous to ask if I can turn on the AC. A reasonable request, right? Well, that's when I learned the AC in the used car I had bought had gone out and only blew hot air. The instructor about pitched a fit. Rest of the test went well though. Only got marked off for one thing. Forgetting to use my turn signal when pulling out of a parallel parking spot or something like that. I'm going to flip this. I was the student and it was the teacher who did the outrageous thing. It was near the end of our training and it was time to merge onto a highway. The town we were in had nice, long, straight merge ramps with good visibility for the lane you were merging into. So I start down the ramp. I shoulder check 2-3 times and pick the spot I'm going to merge into. There wasn't very much traffic coming. The only car in the lane I wanted to merge into was several car lengths back. So I pick my merge spot and adjust my speed so that when I merge into the lane, I'm still 4 cars lengths ahead of the car on the highway. Things are looking good. Just as I reach the end of the merge lane, right before I'm about to merge, my instructor slams on his brake and brings the car to a complete stop. He braked so hard it threw everyone in the car forward in their seats. We are now sitting at the end of the merge lane, completely stopped. I lost it on him. I yelled at him, why did he do that? He told me I was going to hit the car on the highway. At that moment, the car passed us, which proved I wasn't going to hit it. There were 3 other students in the back seat. They all told him there was no way I was going to hit that car and commented that he could have killed us had there been a car behind us on the on-ramp. We had to sit there at the end of the merge lane until the highway was completely clear so I could finally get on the highway. We had 2 more lessons after this. He never took anyone else on the highway, but did pass us all. That's actually how the only ever death at my driving school occurred. Students wanted to merge on the highway but got scared and made a full break. Truck coming from behind didn't see and flattened them like a pancake. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.